Welcome everybody. This research seminar is curated and organized by the Gender Equality and Diversity team at WIFO, which besides me includes Susanne Bernd-Sieber and Anna Albert. And this is why I have the pleasure to introduce Ulrich today and also to provide a short comment afterwards. Ulrich Glogowsky is Professor of Economics at the University of Linz. He is Distinguished Research Affiliate at CSIFO and affiliate at the Kurt Rothschild School of Economics and Statistics. His research interests focus on public economics. Currently, he studies various forms of inequality, the effects of inheritance taxes, aspects of income taxation, the long-run effects of social policy, online media and polarization, and racial discrimination. And the paper Ulrich presents today is titled The Parenthood Penalty in Mental Health. And it's joint work together with Alexander Ahamer, Martin Haller, and Timo Henner. And thank you, Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation. Really pleasure being here today. Yeah, this is a paper we started a couple of years ago, actually, when I got my first child. It sort of made me interested in the topic. As you already said, it's called the Parenthood Penalty in Mental Health. We are currently revising the paper for WIFO version. We're working on the new version, so all your comments are really highly welcome. So mental illness is unfortunately widespread. For example, around 20% of US American adults live with it, and about 8% of all the years lived with disability are the result of depression and anxiety. In many countries, depression is actually the leading cause of disability, and it's a highly gendered phenomenon. In 2023, US women were 1.4 times more likely to face mental health issues as compared to men. Okay, it's working. At the same time, mental illness is also economically costly. It's not only widespread, it affects labor market outcomes. There's a lot of literature on that. It hinders human capital investments, affects non-cognitive skills. So if I'm depressed, little motivation, probably little focus, and then this might affect my productivity and ultimately also my wages. So on a broader scale, mental health is a key component of individual well-being, and mental illness really indicate losses in this important domain. We as economists, we really care about well-being, so therefore understanding the causes of mental illness and understanding why women are more affected by it really seems important, but there's still a lot that we do not fully understand. And this sort of motivates this paper. In this paper, we're going to reveal a key source of persistent mental health issues, and those are actually a major driver of the gender gap in mental health, as it turns out, that is parenthood. So we're going to present a couple of main insights in the paper. So the first insight is that many long-lasting mental health issues actually can be tied back to parenthood. So before giving birth, many men and women do just fine. The first child is born, mental health drops and stays on lower levels for many, many years. We show that the mental health costs are highly gendered in the sense that the negative effects of childbirth, those are much larger for women as compared to men. And this is what we call the parenthood penalty in mental health in our paper. In our paper, we're also going to show that those penalties do not only reflect postpartum depression and are unlikely the result of differential help-seeking behavior between men and women. So now we have this general gender gap in mental health between men and women, and given those large parenthood penalties that we find, we next want to ask what part of the overall gap between, like in mental health between men and women, can be explained by parenthood. And then we're going to show that the parenthood penalties actually explain a key part of why women face mental illness more frequently than men. So if you're concerned about mental health equality, then we're sort of concerned about the role of children. Given this result, it seems quite natural to ask if policymakers can intervene, right? Can they really reduce mothers' mental health burden if they wanted to? And one policy that directly comes to mind are parental leave reforms, because parental leave actually gives mothers more time to adapt to the new situation. But then in the paper, we're going to show that parental leave extensions actually backfire and boost the parenthood penalties. So mothers who quasi-experimentally take longer leaves when the child is still small actually face larger or higher probabilities to suffer from mental health issues, not only in the short, but also in the long run. Together, this result and other results that we have in the paper are sort of in line with the idea that the parenthood penalty reflects the effects of raising children. So first of all, we see that we have larger penalties for mothers who spend more time on exclusive childcare when the child is still small, and this is quasi-experimental evidence. But then in the follow-up paper, we also show that fathers who quasi-experimentally invest more time in kids, more time in education and so on, also get more mental health problems. And lastly, we have this finding that matched adoptive mothers also encounter substantial penalties. And this really indicates that it's not only about biology, not only about postpartum depression, because we have the same types of effects for matched adoptive mothers. So we're going to derive these types of results by combining a couple of quasi-experimental research designs and administrative data from Austria and Denmark, two countries. The key challenge for the paper is obviously that mental health is quite difficult to measure. It's an unobserved state. So we do a couple of things in the paper. One thing that we do is we quantify the mental health state with data on antidepressant prescriptions. And here we follow a couple of prominent papers, but then we also do more in the paper to make sure that we really observe mental health effects. The first effect or benefit of prescription data is that they really indicate clear mental health problems. You only get a prescription once you have a diagnosed mental illness. But then prescription data can be really observed for the population for administrative data. And prescription data is also highly comparable across different countries, which is another benefit. So taking everything together, we think we offer a couple of contributions to the literature. The first contribution is we really demonstrate the long-run impacts of parenthood on mental health for two countries using a design-based approach and administrative data. There's some correlational literature in the literature, mostly in the medical literature, that focuses on the short run and postpartum depression. Our goal is really to focus on the longer one. Then we are the first paper that explicitly studies if mothers or fathers carry the larger mental burden of parenthood, so the inequality dimension that is really new. And we showed that the child penalties really extend beyond income into the mental health domain. And then we study the impacts of family policies on mental health penalties. So here, inequality is the outcome, so to speak. So why do we believe that it's a good idea to study two countries at the same time, and why did we pick Austria and Denmark? So the first benefit of doing this is we really want to push external validity. We want to know whether the decline in mental health is a more general phenomenon that we see beyond one particular country. And then we decided to pick two countries that are very different in dimensions that could critically influence the mental health burden of parenthood. Because in both countries, we have very different gender norms, right? Norms are much more conservative in Austria. This can be nicely shown in survey data. Here, women are frequently seen as the main child carer, which is quite different in Denmark. We have also very different family policies. So in Austria, parent leave is much longer as compared to Denmark, again, in line with the idea that mothers are the main caregivers. And we have much better availability of childcare or formal childcare in Denmark, particularly for younger mothers. On top of that, we have very different levels of child-related earnings inequality in Austria and Denmark. So their earnings penalties are much higher for Austrian mothers. And all these types of things actually could influence the mental health burden that mothers face. The second reason why we picked those two countries is that the two countries are actually similar enough so that we can meaningfully compare the outcomes. Both countries are rich and have universal healthcare systems. They spend a similar fraction of the GDP, around 10% on healthcare. They have very similar aggregated health outcomes, child mortality, life expectancy, very comparable. And also the mental health care utilization levels are very comparable between the two countries. And most importantly, we have very comparable or similar data for both countries, and therefore can construct our outcomes in a very similar way. And this already brings me to the data. Right? So what is the data that we're going to use? This is, I believe, what makes our paper really interesting, because we can combine multiple data sources for both countries. So first of all, we have register data that holds information on childbirth, employment, earnings, and much more. Then we can combine this with administrative health data that we obtain from the health insurances. And this data is amazing. It holds information on prescriptions of all different types of drugs. We see doctor visiting behavior, what type of doctor was visited and when. And we have data on inpatient diagnoses, so we even see what happened in hospitals. Then we can completely measure antidepressant prescriptions because they're covered by the health insurance. And the data is based on the ATC classification. So this is like a strategy to classify drugs. And based on this classification, we can make sure to compare the same types of drugs across the different countries. Regarding the sample, our sample runs from 1998 to 2016. We focus on parents who got the first child between 2002 and 2007. So we have enough pre- and post-birth periods. And in Austria, our sample covers approximately 17% of the population. So, empirical approach. So our goal is to estimate 3 types of causal effects. First of all, we want to estimate the effects of parenthood on mothers' mental health. Then we want to do the same for fathers. And ultimately, we're interested in the impacts on gender inequality. So there's a quite big literature discussing how to estimate effects on outcomes of mothers and fathers with a focus on income. The issue with the available approaches is that most of the available papers use instrumental variable strategies. And therefore, we only get estimates for very, very specific subgroups, certain sets of compliers. So for example, a couple of papers used in vitro fertilization success as an instrument for childbirth. This might be nice from an identification perspective, but this also means that we only get effects for mothers and fathers, or potential mothers and fathers who try to get pregnant using these types of technologies. In our paper, we are, however, interested in the much broader effects for all parents in our population, not only interested in the effects on those subsets, and because ultimately we want to understand the effects on overall gender inequality and mental health. So following this idea, we're going to follow Kleven and Corpus and use a very simple event study approach to achieve those goals. So this approach really allows us to identify the 3 causal effects for the population of mothers and fathers. And the idea of the approach is actually quite simple. We're going to exploit some changes in outcomes after childbirth to identify the effects of interest. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce the approach. And I do this based on figures and based on simulated data. I use simulated data here because I want you to focus on like the strategy, the estimation strategy, and not the results. But I'm quite sure that many of you already know how to do this. Nevertheless, I want to introduce this like in a very, very intuitive way. So we're going to proceed in 3 steps. Step 1 is we want to estimate the effects of parenthood on mothers and antidepressant prescriptions. So causal effect 1. So for the purpose, we take the sample of mothers, and for them we estimate event studies, which basically means that we plot prescription probabilities of mothers around childbirth. So here is when the first child is born, those are the years before, and those are the years after giving birth to the first child. So before birth, what you typically see in the data is that the prescription probability evolves around constant as long as you filter out age dummies and year dummies. So if you control for the fact that older mothers have a higher probability to take antidepressants, and if you control for the fact that over the years antidepressant prescriptions increase, then you get a constant trend basically before birth. And we don't have this only in the simulated data, but also in the real data. Now, in my simulated data, I have assumed for a moment that the prescription probability shoots up directly after childbirth. And now we want to know what part of this potentially increase is the result of parenthood. Now, as you know, the events of parenthood, so we need the counterfactual to approximate the world without children, right? So the event study, as you know, event study approach typically constructs this counterfactual by simply assuming that prescriptions without children would have remained at their pre-birth level, so would have followed this black trend. If this is actually the case, then obviously the difference between the red and the black line identifies the impacts of children in one particular post-birth year. Now you might say, is this assumption really plausible? Does this even make sense? Well, you can argue, you know what, before birth, prescription pathways are smooth, so why should it suddenly change after childhood? But then, of course, I totally understand you're skeptic, that you can be skeptic about this type of claim, because there could be other things that are changing over time. So you can sort of relax the identifying assumptions, and you can try to find a control group. So, for example, one thing that we do in the paper is we use matched women without children as a control group for mothers, right? And then we sort of approximate prescriptions in a world without children for mothers by the prescription path of women who indeed never got children. And then, of course, everything is identified under the standard matching assumption that you have to make. So, and then you can do more. You can also compare this approach to IB estimation strategies to make sure that we really identify meaningful effects. So now you might say, all right, now we have the effects for women. Let's do the same for fathers. So this is the second step. We do precisely the same kind of thing for fathers. And we assume in the simulated data that the impacts for fathers are relatively small. And now comes the key step, probably the thing that many of you haven't seen before, I don't know. In the last step, you really want to estimate the effects on mental health inequality. So how can we actually do this? We put everything together, right? So now here we have the effects for fathers and mothers. But then in this figure, you also see that mothers have actually, and this is also something that we see in the data, have a more general higher prescription probability before birth. And the very important thing is that as long as those are constant baseline differences, right, then we know, and we only observe them pre-birth, then we know that those baseline differences cannot be related or unrelated to parenthood. So we can simply subtract the baseline differences, so to make sure that they do not confound parenthood-related inequality. And we then identify the effect on inequality by comparing the effects for mothers with the effects for fathers. And we say whenever the impacts on mothers are larger than the impacts on fathers, then we get additional gender inequality because of childbirth, right? And this estimator is identified under parallel non-child trends. We call it the estimator of the parenthood penalty in mental health. Okay, that is the estimation strategy. Make sense? Any questions on that so far? No. Okay, so now we can finally talk about the results. So here's the first one. Parenthood leads to an increase in antidepressant prescriptions. And that one is actually bigger for mothers. So here we first focus on Austrian mothers, right? And here is the point in time when the first child is born. And those are the effects on the prescription probability. You see, indeed, before childbirth, prescriptions evolve around constant. Then you see, around childbirth, the prescription probability drops by a lot, which makes perfect sense. If you're breastfeeding, if you're pregnant, then you're not supposed to take all types of medication. So we get this negative effect. But then, most importantly, we see that in the long run, we get those bigger positive impacts, and those actually are growing over time. In the 9th year after giving birth, the prescription probability is 5 percentage points higher compared to the counterfactual without children. We get the same estimate if we use our comparison group or our control group, then the effects are precisely the same. This is a massive increase of 167% relative to the baseline probability to take antidepressants. Or to put it differently, 9 years after giving birth, almost 8% of all mothers in our sample take antidepressants. Right? So many mothers are taking antidepressants. Now we add fathers to the picture. So fathers, here we have common trends before birth, but then we also get those increases in the effects over time. But the effects are actually smaller. And this translates into a substantial parenthood penalty in mental health. the impact of children on women's prescription probability actually exceeds that of men by around 3 percentage points, okay? So larger impacts on women. Now you might say, you know what, that's interesting, but it's only Austria. So what about Denmark? So those are the figures for Denmark. You see in Denmark, precisely the same types of shapes of the effect. Everything is on a little bit lower level. And also the gap between the blue and the red line is a little bit smaller. Here it's only around 2 percentage points. In Denmark, we can actually follow parents over 24 years after giving birth. Of course, in the long run, the identifying assumptions are stronger, obviously. But then even in the long run, we have the same types of gaps. So now, interpretation. So when seeing this, the first response that you might have had is probably your response is, well, this is only about biology. We already know that many mothers suffer from postpartum depression, and probably this is something that then translates into long-run mental health problems. And we do actually a lot in the paper to check this hypothesis. The only thing I'm going to show you today is we studied impacts on parents with adoptive children. Because when you have adoptions, then of course this biological channel cannot play any role, right? And also stuff like postpartum depression and so on shouldn't be so severe. So this is what we find for parents with adoptive children, precisely the same type of patterns. Of course, the confidence intervals are not wider because the samples are much smaller. But again, we have much larger effects for mothers with adoptive children as compared to fathers. This is actually in line with the interpretation that we observe effects of having a child instead of the biological effects of giving birth to a child. Right. So next, you might think, you know what, we see this penalty in prescriptions, but is this actually reflecting actual differences in mental health? So is it really the case that mothers carry a larger mental burden? So to structure the discussion, note that we observe prescriptions in our data. If a person feels mentally unwell, is sick, if the person seeks help, and if a healthcare provider actually prescribes treatment ultimately. And now we want to know whether whether it could be the case that the effects that we are seeing are the result of the first bullet point in this list here. So to structure the discussion a little bit on that, in the new version of the paper, we're going to have a small model that discusses the conditions under which we really can identify mental health effects, and we sort of discuss the identifying assumptions that we need to identify signs of the effects and also point estimates, right? I have no time to talk about all the details, but in principle, what I can tell you now is the penalty intuitively would not reflect an increase in real mental health. If fathers are obviously equally distressed, but are far less likely to seek treatment, seek help, for whatever reason. If childbirth causes a pretty strong increase in the detection probability for mothers. So the mental health state is the same, but detection probabilities go up for whatever reason. For example, because I change my help-seeking behavior, or I'm getting screened more closely after childbirth. And lastly, it also could be the case that antidepressant prescriptions are simply a bad proxy for mental health distress for whatever reasons. And in the next couple of minutes, I want to discuss all these concerns that you already might have had empirically. So first of all, what about help seeking? What about help seeking asymmetries across the sexes? That obviously is something we cannot observe in the administrative data. It's impossible. But now we found this very nice survey data set, and the survey data set is really nice because we have data for Denmark and Austria, and the survey data set holds information on two things. First, self-reported information stating whether someone is taking antidepressants or not. Second, a measure for mental health that is actually measured using psychological scale. So the measure has been developed by doctors, basically, and it's a widely applied measure to actually approximate the mental health state. And using this data, we can show for Denmark and also for Austria that conditional on being sick, in the two countries, the probability to seek help is precisely the same for men and women. And this is a result that speaks against this hypothesis. The second kind of concern that you might have had is you could imagine that instead of seeing a doctor, men self-medicate, right? They drink more, they smoke more, take more legal drugs, and so on. But actually, in the very long run, this also is health outcome relevant, right? If they smoke a lot, then they're going to see this in the health data in the very long run. So we can also check this hypothesis in the administrative data, and we find no indication in line with this hypothesis that men self-medicate more. If anything, again, it's the other way around. For Austria, we find indeed some effects on self-medication for women, but not for men. Next, the effects on the detection probability for mothers, right? So when presenting the paper in the past, sometimes like people in the audience, they basically stated, you know what, after childbirth, I have much more time because I'm not working anymore. So now I have a lot of time and I can seek help more easily. Right? I don't know whether those people had children or not, but it's just the comment that I really frequently got. Another one is the comment on screening. So first of all, regarding help seeking, it's very important to understand that in Austria and in Denmark, general practitioners prescribe over 80% of all antidepressants. Like in our data, 85% around the number get prescribed by general practitioners. So if we indeed would see changes in help-seeking behavior post-birth, then we would see in the data that the numbers, or like doctor-seeking behavior of general practitioners for women goes up relative to men, right? But this is, again, precisely the opposite of what we find. We see that after childbirth, women actually see general practitioners less frequently, not more frequently, speaking against the hypothesis that they simply have more time. It seems to be the other way around. Regarding the screening hypothesis, we find no spike in prescriptions right after birth when these screenings actually take place. Our effects materialize rather in the long run, but if like the effects would be screening relevant, then we precisely should know when we get those effects because we know when the screenings actually take place, and this is also not what we see in the data. On top of that, we have similar effects for adoptive mothers. Adoptive mothers have much less postpartum contact with the healthcare system. We don't have similar screenings for them. And also the fact that we have the similar effects for them also speaks against the screening hypothesis. Last is antidepressants, or are antidepressants simply a bad proxy? So what we do is we study other outcomes. We find parental penalties for other outcomes that also reflect mental health problems. For example, doctor-seeking behavior, visits of psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on. Here we see precisely the same type of effects. At the same time, we find no penalties for placebo outcomes that are completely unrelated to mental health problems. For example, prescriptions of other nervous system drugs. So the placebo tests also work. So probably you're still not convinced. So another thing that we recently did is we found, again, survey data. And this survey data holds information on self-reported happiness and life satisfaction. And then using this data, we can also show that Parenthood reduces self-reported happiness for women more than men. So taken together, we believe that we at least do not find like a lot of evidence for the alternative explanations. And then in the paper, we can also do the bounding exercise, but as I told you before, I have no time to talk about it. So Parenthood increases antidepressant prescriptions for men and women. Effects are larger for women. And the phenomenon is general in the sense that we have it in a gender conservative and gender progressive setting. And we found it actually quite surprising. And we found it's a quite strong result that we have the same types of findings in a setting like Denmark, where we have much more progressive norms and different policies. And all those differences are not enough to entirely close the gap. We do a lot of heterogeneity analysis, but again, I have no time to talk about those. We can talk about heterogeneity later. So in the next step, the goal is to decompose the overall gender gap in mental health into a child-related part and a part that is unrelated to children. And here the motivation is clear. We already know that mothers have a much higher probability to take, for example, antidepressants and so on. At the same time, in our paper, we see that we have large parenthood penalties. And then it becomes quite natural to ask, what part of the overall gap among parents is the result of parenthood, or to put it differently, how would the overall gap have looked like if parents never had children, right? So we're gonna do a simple decomposition exercise, and we do it again for Austria and Denmark. So here is the result for Austria. In Austria, the overall gender gap in antidepressant prescription is 82%. So this means that the prescription probability for mothers exceeds that of fathers by 82%. Now we want to know how this gap would have looked like if parents never had children. So how can we actually do this? Well, our event studies identify the impacts of children, right? So intuitively, we can take the realized outcomes, actual antidepressant outcomes, subtract the impacts of children, and simulate how the gap would have looked like if parents never had children. And this gap is identified under our standard identifying assumption. So when we do this, then we see that the parenthood unrelated gap is 51%. So if parents never had children, the gap only would have been 51%, or to put it differently, the parenthood-related part is 31%. And for Denmark, we find very similar results. Here, the parenthood-related part is a little bit smaller, which makes total sense, because here also the parenthood penalties that we identified are a little bit smaller. So parenthood explains a big part of the overall gender gap in mental health. And my take based on that is actually, if we care about mental health inequality, then we really should think more about the role of children, right? So this is what I take from that. What this also means is that policymakers that have the goal to increase equality in mental health, they actually can do this using interventions that address the parenthood-related part of the gap, right? So this brings me to my next topic, policies, right? One often proposed measure to promote gender equality are parental leave schemes. And the potential argument is straightforward, right? Longer leaves could actually ease the burden on mothers, so by giving them more time to adapt to the new situation and so on. So therefore, in the final analysis, we want to study how parental leave policies actually impact mental health of women and men. Today, I only have time to talk about one study that has been implemented in Austria, but in the paper, we study additional reforms in Austria and Denmark. And that is the reform that I'm gonna study today. It's the 2000 parental leave reform that we implemented here. Here, you already see what the reform did. So you see, where's my pointer? Yeah. You see that this reform actually increased the paid parental leave period from 18 months to 30 months, so by 1 year. All the other features of the scheme have been left unchanged, so the same job protection period, parental benefit payments unchanged, and so on. So we can really identify effects of extending parental leave. A pretty important aspect of the reform is actually that regime eligibility depends on the date of birth of the child. So mothers born before the 1st of July 2000, those mothers were subject to the old regime, and mothers who gave birth after the cutoff actually could stay on leave for 30 months. And this gives us the possibility to estimate regression discontinuity designs, and here we're going to exploit the date of birth of the first child as the forcing variable. Okay? So the first kind of thing that you want to know is you want to know whether the reform actually had buy. So did it shift leave-taking behavior? So here, we're going to plot years on maternal leave as a function of time relative to the cutoff. So this is the reform cutoff. Each dot represents a subsample of mothers who gave birth on this particular day. So this is basically daily information. So, and this is 1 month, right? And now we want to know what happened with years on maternal leave for mothers that are affected by the reforms. And this is leave taking for mothers who became eligible, who could stay longer. We find that mothers take on average 9 additional months of maternity leave if they become eligible. So they could have taken 1 additional month, and indeed they take like 9 additional months of leave. Right? And next, we want to know whether this change in leave-taking, affects mental health of mothers and fathers. So here, we're going to plot, I mean, there are multiple ways how you could study this, right? But here, for time reasons, I'm going to focus on reduced form effects on the yearly prescription probability for mothers. So what we do precisely is the following thing. We take all post-reform data, which is 16 years of data, 16 years of data. Then we construct a panel. The panel dimension is basically mother times year. That's the panel observation. And our outcome is going to be a dummy indicating whether mother was taking antidepressants in one particular year. And then we take this outcome and use it in a very standard regression discontinuity model. Right? And why I'm mentioning this? Because it's very important for the interpretation, for the effect. The effects that I'm going to show you, those are the effects that are based on 16 years of post-birth data. So now we're going to bunch together long one and short one effects, right, in one single graph. And those are going to be the effects on the average yearly prescription probability. Again, those are the mothers who are unaffected by the reform, who gave birth after the birthday, before the birth day cutoff, and those are the affected mothers. So here we see that the reform increased the yearly prescription probability by around 3 percentage points. So you take 9 additional months of leave, and your average yearly prescription probability in the long run is increased by 3.1 percentage points. Then we can also study the timings, the timing of the effects. And what we see is that the first negative effects on mental health actually emerge during the expanded leave period. So when you're longer at home, then this is when first mothers develop problems. But then interestingly, the full effect size hits once mothers enter the labor market again. So once you're starting to work again, this is really where we get the biggest effects. And then we have those larger effects in the long run, right? At the same time, there are no impacts on earnings, employment, and earnings penalties. So there's no difference, like only short-run effects, but no long-run effects. So the effects that we see on mental health cannot run through those labor market responses, right? So there are no long-run impacts on those dimensions. Next, we want to know whether there are spillovers on fathers, but actually there are none. So what this means is that fathers who have partners who take longer leaves are unaffected by the reform. So no impacts on fathers. And then we do the same kind of thing for all different types of other reforms, and we find a very general consistent picture. So mothers who stay longer on leave have higher probabilities to take antidepressants. And that is sort of in line with the interpretation that we see effects of raising children, right? Because the treated mothers, those mothers actually spend more time on exclusive childcare when the child is still small. But then you might ask, why do we get long-run effects? And certainly we cannot know for sure. There are multiple alternative hypotheses. One thing that potentially could happen, and is in line with the data, is that the reforms could shift the long-run caregiving activities of mothers. When you're longer at home with your child, when the child is still small, probably this also affects sort of what you do in the long run. At the same time, we see in the data that you're not adjusting your labor supply behavior. And in principle, then it could be the case that your total load is simply higher, right? But of course, there are alternative explanations as well. So what are the implications for mental health penalties? Well, we only find effects for mothers and no impacts on fathers. So this means that we get more inequality because of the reforms. And I'm already done. So in this paper, we estimate the impact of parenthood on mothers and fathers' mental health. We have those negative impacts and antidepressant prescriptions. The impacts are larger for mothers. And we see that those negative impacts on mothers actually, or more generally, the parenthood explains a key part of why women face mental illness more frequently than men. And then we have the result on parental leave. Right? So parental leave reforms backfire in this dimension. We have larger penalties for mothers who take longer leaves. We also have a follow-up paper. The framing of the follow-up paper is very different. So in this paper, it's essentially a paper on preferences for sons, right? But we have a very interesting result in this paper that also connects to the agenda in a broader sense. So in this paper, we showed that men in Austria have a pretty strong preference for sons, right? We show this in multiple dimensions. We see this in stated preferences, but also in revealed behavior. For example, the probability to get a second child is much higher if the first child is a girl, if not the son, and stuff like this. We see this in the administrative data. Now, then we see that when men get a son, then they actually spend more time with them, right? At the same time, we see that they then develop more likely depressions, right? So we see you get a son, you're more depressed, but you actually invest more time. That is again in line with the same type of hypothesis that, and again, for those parents, we also see that they're not adjusting their labor supply behavior. So also in this, like in this paper, it could be the case that it's really like we're increasing the overall burden because now I do more at home. I spend much more time with my child, but then I do not reduce my labor supply, and then my total burden is higher. So now, let's assume for a moment that our policy goal would be to foster mental health equality. Of course, there are many trade-offs involved and so on, but let's assume for a moment that this is what we want to do. So what is a policy implication that comes out of that? If we really take this face value, and if we believe our interpretation, then we should reduce the parenting burden on mothers. Probably one policy proposal would be earmarked paternity leave or similar reforms going into this direction. Okay, this is all I wanted to say today. Thanks a lot again, and a lot for the invitation. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hear your comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think very generally, this is really a great paper, which I enjoyed reading very much. And I think it addresses an issue which is very well known to all parents here, namely that parenthood can be mentally taxing. And moreover, probably the majority would agree that the mental burden caused by parenthood is, and the existence of children is probably higher for mothers than for fathers. And the more surprising it is, that the paper is one of the first studies that aim to quantify the effect of mental health problems of parents, and the first one estimating gender differences as it tries to identify parenthood penalty. I think the topic is of broad interest, not only from the individual perspective of individual parents and their individual well-being, but also from an economic, gender, and societal perspective. And of course, for policymakers. Mental health problems of parents have manifold consequences. They may reduce the well-being of children, and as a consequence, the future social and economic outcomes of children. They weigh, of course, on overall productivity. They may exacerbate existing gender gaps in income and pensions if mothers are affected over proportionately by mental health problems that have negative effects on career paths, labor market attachment, and income. Of course, mental illness causes costs for public health systems, drugs and therapies, but also income replacement payments during sick leave. And I think one important aspect is that the fear of a large mental burden associated with parenthood may be one of the reasons for decreasing fertility rates, probably mostly to be observed recently in industrialized, but also in emerging countries. When reading the paper, several questions turned up that could be addressed in future research. One point potentially of interest is, are there differences according to age? Are younger or older parents or mothers more burdened with mental health issues than younger mothers? Are there differences according to income? Which role do difficult economic conditions play for the mental health of parents? And related is the question whether lone parents, and particularly lone mothers, have a higher mental burden than parents living in relationships. And what about same-sex couples with children? That was also one question I was posing myself. And maybe is there a role of grandparents? Does the proximity of grandparents maybe play a role as it could alleviate the childcare burden? Which policy recommendations could we derive from these very interesting results? I think very generally, parents and particularly mothers need more support right from the beginning of parenthood to avoid the occurrence of a parenthood penalty in mental health. And I think that particularly important are measures that decrease the unequal distribution of care work, which is one obviously important reason for the parent penalty, particularly in Austria, where fathers' involvement, one has to say, unfortunately is persistently low. It's it's at a very low level and it just doesn't move. We know that from the data. Another thing is that long periods of parental leave should be avoided. That I think became very obvious. One measure is to divide parental leave more equally. Fathers, generally, the universal availability of childcare will be secured. And the long parental leave variant in Austria, you said that already it was increased, and it's also in international comparison is rather long, should be put in question. I also think that firms have an important role to play, for example, improving the conditions and opportunities to extend fathers' involvement in childcare, and not least, and you mentioned that quite in the beginning of your presentation, societal norms and also individual attitudes are a problem, particularly in Austria. Expectations here are that women take on the primary responsibility for childcare, for child rearing, and the associated informal childcare work. And there are rather strict norms. There was a study published at the Mother's Day from the Austrian Institute of Family Research that said that researchers question what defines a good mother. One thing what defines a good mother, that she takes on the primary burden of child rearing. And these norms, I think, are strongly internalized in Austria. And most interestingly, there are no surveys on the question what defines a good father. So fathers are out of the picture most of the time. And at the same time, women, mothers are increasingly expected to be available for the labor market, considering ongoing demographic changes. And as I said, fathers do not figure very prominently in all of this. But I think they should be more in the focus if you want to reduce the penalty, the parental penalty. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. That's amazing. Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay. Perfect. So, sorry. Heterogeneity. Luckily, we did a bit of it, so I can answer some of the questions that you actually had. We didn't do all of it, but what we actually checked is education, which is sort of related to low income. And then we also check age. And then we also checked a couple of other things. So first of all, we see that the effects are actually lower for highly educated parents. And that is sort of in line with the literature, because there's like one paper actually arguing that education is sort of shielding mothers against mental health issues. And this also could happen here. But then again, this also could be related to norms and so on. So this is what we find here. Then, and we focused on norms and didn't do the income split because we were a little bit worried that income, at least like post-birth income, is too much endogenous, and therefore we thought, okay, let's do education because it's sort of happening, like the education decision mostly happens a couple of years before giving birth. And then age, here we find that the effects are actually larger for younger mothers, substantially larger for younger mothers. And I mean, there are also many reasons why this could be happening. So you still need to establish your career and so on. You might have less financial stability, more uncertainty in your life, and so on. And all these kinds of things could play a role. Another thing that frequently has been asked in the past is child health. Like what happens conditional on child health. And the typical kind of thing or proxy for child health that people frequently use is low birth rate, because this really predicts very well the health of children when they grow older. But we do not find any effect in this dimension. Then grandparents, we had a look, and there was actually nothing, which we found extremely surprising. Also, given that there's like literature for Austria showing that grandparents are a pretty frequently taken substitute for formal childcare. So there seems to be a lot of switching. So we really expected that this potentially could have been played a role, or could have played a role, but we had nothing here. And same-sex couples, this one we didn't do. So thanks a lot. Policies. I agree with all what you said. More support for parents and so on. Like, I think there's really a potential like that there might be an entire agenda. So it might be super interesting to actually check what are the impacts of childcare, formal childcare, and so on, to explore this in more detail. And firms, actually, just last week, we talked about the potential follow-up paper where we were thinking about the role of firms. And then we wanted to study like the firms, not only for mental health penalties, but also for penalties in income. So this is something that we potentially going to work on in the future. Norms, yeah, that's super interesting. One thing that I also would find extremely interesting is to understand how policies actually shape norms. Because from the child penalties in earnings literature, we know that norms are super important when it comes to the sizes of the child penalties. We don't have similar studies for mental health, but I expect the effects are most likely the same. And then the question is really, okay, how can we actually change norms? And one important thing might be public policies. And I know that some people like, for example, Henrik Leben and so on, he really wants big studies on the impacts of public policies on formation of norms. So, for example, what they do in one study is they also have sort of a parent leave reform that gives fathers more childcare time. And then they also have this birthday cutoff, but they actually have a survey running on the entire population. And then so basically everybody in Denmark is getting an invitation to this like survey. And in this paper, then they're going to elicit gender norms. And then they really study, okay, what happens with gender norms once you change the parental leave reform so that fathers take more leave. The study is still in the field. There's only like there are only results out there on the short run effects, not on the long run effects. So we do not fully know. But I guess also when we talk about mental health, the norms are super important, and it would be really amazing to work more on that. A Mother's Day study, that is really interesting that we have no questions on fathers. I didn't know, but this really means that probably also researchers have a bias in this type of direction, which makes it super interesting. So yeah, thanks again for the comments.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting paper. I have an idea of another follow-up paper. Can you link this to education and labor market outcomes for children? For example, you say that spending more time with kids increases adverse effects. If you can also show that spending more time with kids reduces, for example, education outcomes, it would be a real blockbuster paper.
Yeah, this would be really amazing. So in principle, it's possible, but we would have to wait a couple of years, simply given how the timing of the data sets is that we have. But in principle, and then of course in Austria, measuring education, at least until recently, was actually quite difficult, at least in admin data. I heard that some people now got hands on very amazing data in this dimension, but then still the question is whether you can match it or not. But in principle, this really would be amazing, like really, because, and this is also actually what I meant when I was saying, there are many trade-offs involved, like at the end of my presentation, because you never know when you think about parental leave, probably children benefit in whatever dimension, and given that, it would be extremely important to see the full picture. So,
I would be interested, how far can we conclude from the difference between Denmark and Austria that providing more kindergarten places is really helpful for mothers? That would be one question I'm interested in. And the other, having children creates stress. We know this as parents. Having a sick children creates even more stress. So are your results driven by the health status of the children? So maybe you have some women who have sick children who take antidepressants, whereas the majority of women doesn't do it.
So the first one, kindergarten. I guess in principle, we could even do more because in Austria, not like at the kindergarten level, but the Grabelstuben level, like for the youngest children, there has been a little bit of development in childcare spots over the time. And in principle, you could try to exploit this type of variation and then really try to figure out what are the impacts of formal kindergarten on mental health. So in principle, I guess this is really something that we could do in a later paper. Yeah, let's see. So just from the Markwood differences, I'm a little bit afraid that there are so many like different things happening at the same time because also norms are different. Labor supply behavior is different in Austria and Denmark. For example, the probability to take or to work part-time for mothers, I mean, it's almost 60% in Austria. It's only, I don't know, 20% or something in Denmark. And all these kinds of differences obviously also could have an impact. And then I'm really, I'm not entirely sure whether we really can learn something about kindergarten, but we should have a paper on that. And sick children. So the only thing that we have there is like the birth weight split. But in principle, we can do more because we have many, many health outcomes for the children as well. And then we could actually study this more. So thanks a lot. We didn't do this. Like the only split that we did is birth weight. And here we didn't find any effect. But in principle, there could be an effect. We would have to dig deeper in the data.
I have two questions. So first question is, in your event study, you take all women as a control group or all women who don't get children as a control group? Did I get this right?
Not, we have different versions,
Okay.
but we have one version where we do a matching. And then we also, you can have different types of matching approaches. And sometimes you take everybody and sometimes you can just take subsets. And it really wouldn't matter ultimately.
Because here I wonder if there is a selection effect of women who want to have children. I think that's probably the nice thing with the in vitro instrument that you have
Exactly.
the same desire. And I'm wondering if you can solve this with matching. That's the first thing.
Probably, I mean, there's still some selection ongoing. So what we believe, what we control for with those additional control groups is really you control for more general trends in mental health over time, over event time, basically. So this is what you can control for. Of course, there still might be a selection issue, and of course, this is then if you do the IV, then you wouldn't get this problem. We heavily debated whether we also do the IV strategy, and we still don't know. So far we didn't, but probably we do it. We cannot do it for Austria, like the, for example, in vitro fertilization instrument. We cannot do it for Austria simply because we wouldn't have the data, wouldn't see it. But in Denmark, we in principle could do it.
And the second point that bothered me is that, that there is no gender difference in seeking help. So is that really what you also find in causally identified studies on that topic? So is that the thing in the literature? Or how did you do the survey? So how do you check it? Are this just simple logit regressions or linear
I'll show you a couple of things. So I'm actually not aware of a study that is doing this causally. So this also would be extremely nice to do. So I can show you the survey questions that are used here. And if you're really, really interested and you want to dig into like under which conditions our effects identified, then I can also talk about like the real underlying identifying assumptions. But first of all, the surveys. So this is how you measure mental health. And that is a survey question that really has been developed by psychologists, and it's the so-called MHI5 score. And you're getting like surveyed in five dimensions. Are you feeling very nervous? Were you so depressed that nothing could cheer you up? Did you feel calm and connected, and so on and so forth? And then you sort of approximate mental health by that. And then at the same time, they're being asked whether they take antidepressants or not, or whether they were seeking help in the last period or not. And then you can basically estimate help-seeking differences conditional on your mental health status that you study based on the survey. And then we find no differences. But there's really no good, really good evidence on that. So this is really the best that we had for now. But So what we really need for identification is the second one. That is the very important identifying assumption. And that is because like simply how the event studies are basically constructed. So when you think about like mental health is the combination of being really sick, seeking help, age, and receiving treatment at the doctors. Then you can basically write this like probability to receive antidepressants as a combination of those three probabilities: probability to be sick, probability to actually seek help, conditional on being sick, and probability to receive treatment, conditional on being sick and seeking help, right? And then what our event studies identify in a world where you wouldn't have any controls, like for now. Of course, you can make it more complicated. Then you're basically simply comparing like the probability to receive antidepressants between T and the baseline period, T-2, for example. So now you can basically rewrite this, and you can basically say, okay, I can define this kappa value, the kappa. I can define it as the fraction of mental health cases that are actually treated. I'm treated if I'm seeking help, and if I receive treatment at the doctors, right? So this is the kappa. That's the fraction of mental health cases that are actually treated. And now I already see in my event study estimate, I get this kappa. So whenever the kappa is time constant, it's the same in T and minus 2, then I already have identified the sign, right? Because now I have sign identification, I know the sign of the effect is correct. But now I also, on top of that, I can, on top of that, calculate percentage effects. So I divide this estimator by T-2. And if the kappa is time constant, then kappa entirely cancels. So the percentage effect, like not the effects that I was showing you today, like the percentage point effects, but the percentage effects are really point identified under the assumption that kappa is time constant. Right, so that is really the most important thing. It's important that that mothers, that childbirth is not shifting the treatment probability for mothers, and then you need to think about stuff like additional screening, postpartum depression screening, and so on, because this is then like the point of the story that is really really important, and here we really see no differences. So.
I'm sorry.
I'm over time probably, sorry.
Don't worry. I will take two more questions. I have Marion and Helmut, and I think we close afterwards.
I have a question concerning the identification or the poor proxy. Do you know which antidepressants were prescribed? Which drug exactly? Because there are antidepressants that are prescribed for sleeping disorders, which is not necessarily related to mental health. On the other hand, a large fraction of mental health is actually not treated in the medical sector, a traditional medical sector. Psychotherapy usually has no medical background, so you won't find these issues in prescriptions nor visits to doctors.
Yes, so that holds for Austria. Yeah, but saying like it's really important at the first point. We see the type of antidepressants, and again, this is something where we really could do more. So thanks a lot. We didn't exploit so far. So far we use the broad category like for like antidepressants simply. That is what we do. But we could do much more. We also could do more with the data on the diagnoses and for the inpatient visits. Because there, and this is something that we did, and here we really found that it's more about depression and not so much about sleeping disorders and stuff like this. But the other one,
as well, proxy like severity, different drugs are prescribed.
Yeah. So this is also something we didn't, but we ultimately could do. And the other one, in my understanding, that is a phenomenon. I mean, I'm not an entire expert on the Danish health care system, but in my understanding, like the thing that much happens outside of the data, you wouldn't have the problem to the same extent in Denmark, in my understanding. So for Austria, it's certainly true, but then we also have the same kind of thing in Denmark. But that is precisely the reason why we decided to use antidepressants, and for example, not psychology as research is our main outcome, because like an antidepressant prescription, I mean, this typically happens at a GP, and this really can be observed and it's nicely interpretable. Whereas doctor-prescribing behavior, there's also the second sector you wouldn't see in the administrative data, then you run into the types of problems that you're mentioning. And therefore, we are not doing this so much, but as a additional outcome.
Helmut.
I have a question concerning the fathers. The first is, how do you identify fathers, and can you identify fathers for all the children or for which part of the children? The second would be, do you observe different family constellations? Because that might be relevant also for the effects of motherhood, fatherhood on mental health.
So identification of fathers depends on the country. That we're like in Austria, we can first of all identify all fathers who have children when they're married, right? Like children born in wedlocks, then we always can identify fathers. Then we can identify fathers if children are co-insured, and if they have some, like if they take the particular tax deductions, right? And in total, we get like matching for approximately 90% of all the children to the fathers. In principle, in Denmark, we can basically do the matching for the whole population. So that's easy. Then household status. So in Austria, we only observe married or not. That is actually what we have. But in Denmark, we see whether they are cohabiting or not as well. And this is a long time ago, but if I remember correctly, we really found the penalties to be larger for women who were like single mothers and not cohabiting. That is what I recall. We did this, I don't know, probably 1.5 years ago. So. Okay.
I think we could discuss, we could go on for a very long time. Unfortunately, time is over. Thank you very much for this really, really great presentation and for the questions, and have a nice afternoon to everybody.